Go ahead and get started here. And this week, we're going to start out reading a story from the book of Acts. So if you want to follow along with me, it's in Acts chapter 27. Acts chapter 27, we're going to look at verses 13 through 44. It's a bit of a long story here. And my guess is most of you have heard this story, but we're going to take a special look at this story today. So starting at verse 13, it reads, "When a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity. So they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the northeaster swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind. So we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure, so the men hoisted it aboard. Then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together, because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis. They lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved." After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar. And God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island.'" Verse 27. On the 14th night, that's a pretty long storm, isn't it? 14 nights. On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea, when about midnight the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that they would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape the ship, the sailors left the lifeboat down and into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved." So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow struck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely. Have you heard this story before? So in the broader context of what's going on, Paul is a prisoner. He's gone through some nonsense in his life, and what he has done is he's appealed to trial before Caesar. And so he's been held in house arrest and these different things, and now he's on his way to Rome. And on this way to Rome, they have different stops as they go throughout the sea. And now they found themselves where they had a very narrow window, and the sailors decided we can make it. And as they went to try to make it to the next stop, they got caught up in this storm, the storm that just tormented them for 14 days. And there's something important in this storm that I want to point out. Today's lesson is intended to be a very practical lesson about anchors. In this storm, or in this story, we see there's a couple of times where there's anchors that are used. And I thought this is such an important concept. We're going to take some time today, and we're going to learn a little bit about anchors. So at one point they're going along, and in the story it says they took, they call it soundings. What they do is they I think this is where we actually get the Mark and the Mark Twain, right? I think that's where this comes from. But they would drop this stick down there, and there would be different marks. And if it was a certain depth, it would be on the marker, and if it was in between the marks, it would be on the Twain, right? And they would see how deep the water was. And they could see that the water was at one point 120 feet deep. Now it's 90 feet deep. That's telling them what? We're getting close to land. Right, so they'd stop, they drop the anchors, they didn't know what to do, and then finally what they do is they just cut the anchors, they raise the sail, and the boat goes to shore. It wrecks, and they all get off, and they get in there. It's it's quite an adventure, to say the least. Now, in recent weeks, as I was preparing for this, I was thinking about if any of you followed the news real close around Hurricane Helene a couple of weeks ago. There was this guy that the media called Lieutenant Dan. Did anybody see any of those stories? Nobody saw, okay. Has anybody seen Forrest Gump? All right, there's a few people who have seen Forrest Gump, right? And he had Lieutenant Dan. Now, Lieutenant Dan lived on a boat, and at one point, he survives a storm. Well, there was like a real life Lieutenant Dan here during Hurricane Helene, who he was just going to live on his boat. That hurricane was going to come. He was going to stay on his boat, and that's what it turned. And there was all this, people were sure he was going to die, whatever. He survived it. He later got arrested. If you really want to go follow that story, I learned a little bit about that last night. But what did he do? He got on his boat, and when the hurricane came, the boat was secured. The boat was anchored to keep. Now the water was going all over the place, but he survived. And as we look at this story with Paul, the crew of his ship had no control over that storm. They were being battered from every different direction, and they used their anchors as a last resort to keep the boat from crashing onto the rocks. And, I think that this is such a wonderful illustration for just what is the purpose of an anchor. It's not just to keep something steady, but it's to actually hold something in place when conditions may be beyond control. Right? The anchor serves as a great example for us on how we can go through the storms of life. So I want to make sure I got the right audience here this morning. So has anybody here ever experienced a storm of life? If you haven't, this may not be the lesson for you today. If you've gone through a storm of life, maybe this will help. Maybe this will help today, right? You go through a time when you're getting hit from every different angle. You go through a time, perhaps when you're even taking on some water, right? It's during these times there's an important question to consider, and it's, what are you anchored to? What are you anchored to? How do you keep connected, and how do you not just completely crash? How do you just not completely crash? Now, I don't really care for the water. I don't know how to swim, which is so challenging for me when the kids go and they play in the water. I'm very uncomfortable around that because I know if something happened, I couldn't help them. I don't have that skill. As such, I don't spend a whole lot of time on boats. I know people like to go out and go fishing and do these different things. That ain't me. That's not what I do. So I had to learn a little bit about what is it that anchors do, right? And one of the things that an anchor does, and you're going to get some world-class art today. You're going to get some world-class art, right? This is supposed to be a boat, all right? And this is the water, and this is the anchor. And for those of you that go out fishing, this is the big fish right here. That's what you're looking for, right? I know you're looking for that in the picture, right? But what happens is when the anchor is dropped, right, what it does is it prevents the boat from drifting. Right? It can go a little bit this way, it can go a little bit that way. There's some tension held on it because the water pushes the boat up, so it stays pretty stable. It digs into a solid foundation on the seabed, and it gives the boat some stability and resilience, that it's not going to just go off somewhere else. What's interesting is that you could have all sorts of storm happening up above water, but underwater it can still be calm. It can be peaceful, it can be steady. So similarly, we need to recognize that being spiritually anchored helps us stay grounded amidst the challenges of life. If we don't have an anchor, we could easily be swept away. Right? We could be swept away. Now, I think that an anchor needs three things. Anchor needs three things. Number one, it needs to have some weight to it, right? You need to have something that can go down. Something that can hold on, right? It's got to have some weight to it. Let me see if I can come up with a bad example off the top of my head here. If you just used a can of Campbell's soup, you tied a string around it and you threw that down, that doesn't have a whole lot of weight to it, right? It's not going to hold you. It's got to have your anchor needs to have some weight to it. The second thing it has to have some reach. Right? If you have an anchor and it's just got a foot of rope to it, that's not very much reach. It's not going to do a whole lot. And then the third thing that we need is connection. Ideally, the anchor would go down and it would hit the ground, and there'd be contact, right? There'd be something that it would settle on. Without the weight, the anchor will not descend to the bottom of the sea. Without the reach, the anchor will not have as much of an effect. And without a connection, the anchor has nothing really to hold on to. And so I got to thinking about some extreme examples for this. In the military, they have these giant aircraft carriers. I thought, do they have anchors? The answer is yes, they have anchors. And you know what? And what I was able to find is that their anchors weigh 30,000 pounds. 15 tons. Now these are like floating cities, right? They got all sorts of, like these are big things. They said that the chain that holds that the anchor is attached to, each link in the chain is 365 pounds, right? Like it's big. And so when the aircraft carrier gets out there and it's in the middle of the ocean, it can be going all around. And what they'll do is they'll lower the anchors, and the anchors may not even get all the way to the ground, but what they do is they help balance. They give balance and stability so the boat won't turn over, right? So we need to recognize that anchors can also be helpful. Instead of reducing drift, they can also help you hold position. Anchors can help you hold positions. In the deepest waters, an aircraft carrier maintains its position through a combination of different stabilizing techniques. So we need to recognize that for spiritual anchoring, we need to be anchored to something solid, even in the depths of life's storms, right? We need to find ways that we can stay steady even when we're facing many of these challenges. Physically, if you were out, and it's maybe a little bit appropriate today, I don't know if it was raining when you came in this morning. It was raining whenever I came in. It wasn't a bad rain. But have you ever been outside in a heavy rain? What do you do differently? Does your posture change? Do you maybe put something up? You may lean, you may crouch, you may put a hand up. Like if the wind is blowing, you don't walk the same way. You sometimes you have to lean into the wind as you're going. Like we need to recognize that. Like this is sort of what anchoring does. It's something that helps give you that stability and balance whenever you face some of these different challenges that come along. So this morning, I wanted to just take some time and to remind us that our faith needs to be rooted in something unshakable. We need to be anchored to something unshakable. Hebrews chapter 6, verses 16 through part of 19. If you want to turn there with me. The writer of Hebrews says that people swear by someone greater than themselves, right? And the oath confirms that what is said, and the oath confirms what is said and puts an end to all arguments. Because God wants to make the unchanging nature of His purpose very clear to the heirs of what was promised, He confirms it with an oath. God did this so that two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled to take hold of the hope set before us may be greatly encouraged. We have this hope as an anchor. We have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. Right? Our souls must be anchored to something firm and secure. Something bigger than we are. Right? Something bigger than we are. And this connection gives us hope and confidence and peace, even when you're facing challenge and hardship. In our story, Paul's on his way to Rome, and he finds himself in a literal storm on a boat. But what was Paul spiritually anchored to? He was spiritually anchored to God. And the storm's going on for a couple of days. And Paul goes and he says, you know what? Last night, what happened? I was visited by an angel. And the angel told me that nobody here is going to die. We're all going to make it. The boat's not going to make it, but the rest of us, we're going to make it. And he gives some counsel and some instruction. Paul was so anchored in that story. He had complete confidence. Why? Because the word had been given. Just as the writer of Hebrews says, it says, people swear by something greater than themselves. Paul says, this is what God told me through his angel. And he said, I know God can't lie. I know this is what's going to happen. That's where we find ourselves. God had confirmed his purpose for Paul. You need to go. You need to stand before Caesar. Right? And so Paul had complete confidence, and he shared that confidence with others. He shared it with the crew. He shared it with the soldiers. He shared it with the prisoners. Because he was anchored, he had courage. And I'm going to tell you right now, courage is contagious. Courage is contagious, even in threatening circumstances. Paul's unwavering faith anchored him. He reassured others, showing how he was anchored in his faith, and that provided courage even in this life-threatening situation. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, when we face the storms, what are we anchored to? And let me make this personal. When you face your storms, what are you anchored to? And as I was putting this lesson together, I came to realize that we're anchored to a great many things. Or at least I am. I suspect you are too. And sometimes we're anchored to things, we can even become anchored to things unknowingly. We can become connected. There's some people that will become so connected, they'll be so anchored to a career or a job or a food or a beverage, right? None of you is going to be surprised if I said I am anchored to Coca-Cola. That doesn't surprise any one of you, right? It's like, and you know that if I go to a restaurant and they don't have Coca-Cola, I'm off. Trace will tell you, I'm off balance. I'm not comfortable there, right? It's to the point where I actually travel with Coca-Cola in the car just to make life a little bit easier, right? If I'm without a Coke, I'm off balance. Or we don't go there. That's true. That's true. What do you think about this place? They don't serve Coke. Not real interested in going there. Or I'll say we can go there, but I'm going to smuggle a bottle of Coke in with me. I've done that, right? I got issues. Right? But I mean, I use this. I hope you can laugh with me or at me or whatever that story does. But the purpose of that is just for us to recognize that we can be anchored to all sorts of things. We can be anchored to all sorts of things. Some people are anchored to a job. Right? And when the storm comes and that job goes away, they're lost. They're completely disconnected. I think we could come to agreement, and I don't know that this describes you, but you probably know somebody like this. There's some people who become so anchored to politicians. They do. And it's at all levels. It could be local to international, right? They become so anchored, they become so connected. Some people are hopeful and other people are distraught, right? When things go sideways, it's like, and things often go sideways in politics and international affairs. What happens? People blame, right? It's because there's this unreasonable connection. And so I need to ask you this morning, what are you connected to? What are you connected to? You may have many anchors. I'm suspicious that we all have several anchors. But the question is this: are you anchored to things that will hold firm in a crisis? Are you anchored to things that will hold firm when there is a challenge? Sometimes our anchors are limiting thoughts or beliefs. Sometimes we become anchored to the lies of the enemy. Those lies that the enemy has whispered to us countless times throughout our lives. We could be anchored to self-doubt. We could be anchored to negative influence. And we can be anchored to things that hold us back from experiencing what God would have us experience, from doing what God would have us do. Some people are anchored to other people's thoughts and opinions of them. Right? You know anybody like that? I suspect we do. And other people's thoughts about people can be quite devastating. They can be quite devastating. And I think we would come to agreement here this morning that we should be anchored to what God says about us. I think we would have come to that agreement, right? I don't think we're going to argue that for very long. We should come to agreement that we were anchored to, we are loved, that we are chosen, and that we are capable to do the things that God would have us do. I have a couple of verses here I'll just touch on briefly. You might just want to write them down. Isaiah 41, God says, I am with you. Right? There's some people who are anchored to the idea that they're alone. Galatians chapter 3, God says, you are my child. There's some people that feel like they don't belong. Right? Jeremiah 29, God says, I have plans for you. And there's some people who feel like they have no purpose. They have no plan, right? Those are just some of the things. Several months ago, we did a lesson, and it was titled something like Words to Live By, something like that. But we talked about what are those things that we say to ourselves. You may want to go back and watch that lesson again or listen to that lesson, because I think this probably would have been a good lesson to have right after that one. But here we are. But in that lesson, we talked about what are some of the scripture that or encouraging words that we should memorize or that we should meditate on. What are those promises that God gives us that help reinforce the truths about us? Many of you are familiar that God has given many, many promises. And if we rattled them off, you would say, yep, that's one of God's promises. My question is, are you anchored to them? Are you anchored to those promises? And it's one thing to say, oh yeah. It's another thing to say, oh yeah, when you're going through the storm of life. Because those storms can be tough. Those storms can absolutely be tough. You may recognize them, but you may not be as anchored to them as you would like to be. So being anchored requires that we build a habit. We need to build a habit. And this is something that I will call anchoring. Hey, look at this. We're going to talk about anchoring. How do we build these habits that we can be connected to these? How can we be reminded? How can we be held stable? How can we not drift? What are those things that we need? And I got to thinking about, we all have certain things that we're anchored to, like from a memory standpoint, right? There's certain smells that you know exactly where you're at. Right? The county fair has a certain smell to it. The cotton candy has a certain smell to it, right? There's certain sounds, right? There's certain things that you hear, like, or even a little music. Like if I started out and I said, give me a break, break me off a piece of that You see, it's anchored. It's anchored. Now, just as an aside, there's people in my household that declare the wonders of Kit Kat bars. We had a basket of some Halloween candy. It was a mixture. There were Kit Kats in there. The only thing left in that basket right now is they ain't that good, right? I get it. I'm not a big fan of Kit. Give me a Reese cup over a Kit Kat bar, but there's sounds, there's phrases, there's jingles, there's whatever it is. These are all things that we become anchored to. In recent years, I've done some studying of habits. I find this a fascinating place to look at, and much has been said about how long it takes for a habit to form. Has anybody heard that like 21 days and you can have a new habit? Anybody heard any other numbers? 40 days in a new habit? 60 days in a new habit? How about 1 day? Anybody ever heard that one? It's all junk. Like there's no science that actually proves that 21 days and you have a new habit. You can think, this is what I know. Good habits are hard to make. Bad habits are easy. I get it. I can be in a bad habit like that. Like that. A bad habit, hitting the snooze bar. Like if you hit the snooze bar, like how many times can you hit it? Like you can hit it for quite a while. I'll just take my word for it if you don't know that. You can hit it for quite a while, right? That's where we are. Habits are essentially developed two ways. First way is you can develop a habit immediately. Boom, once and done. And this typically involves something bad. So, and I've probably given you this example before. You're in the kitchen, the stove's on, you put your hand on a hot burner, your habit is forever changed. You will never go near a hot burner again. You will be very, very cautious around that. A habit can happen instantaneously. Otherwise, it's going to require time and repetition. Time and repetition, time and repetition, time and repetition. You just keep going and going and going and going. You may have had a habit of eating something, but then at some point you had a bad reaction to eating that something, and what happens is you do not go and eat that thing again. For me, whenever I was a kid, it was popcorn. There was one night I ate so much popcorn, I got sick. I didn't touch popcorn again for probably a decade. And like those of you that love popcorn know that that's what a tragedy, right? What a tragedy. I need a lot of grace as I share this story with you this morning. All right, I'm going to share. It may go. I'm going to do my best to tell it as cleanly as possible, but I'm probably going to have to push the boundaries here a little bit. So I just ask your indulgence here this morning. But many years ago, my family was headed by caravan to Allentown, Pennsylvania. You know where this is going? She'll know. We had this convoy. I had a car, and my brother had a car, and we had people in the car, and we're going to Allentown. We're going out I-80. And as memory serves, we stopped at DuBois. Now, DuBois is exit, I think, 101-ish on, is that right, Scott? I think it's 101. 101 on I-80. And we stopped, and we have these kids, and we eat at Burger King. And now we're getting back on I-80. We're going east. We're headed out to Allentown. And this is in the days before text messages, all right? This is still in the days of flip phones. And so what would happen is we would actually call each other every so often and say, hey, we need to stop and get gas. Hey, we need to stop and get something to eat. And we did. We had Star Wars code. So Will was red leader. I was gold leader. For those of you that have watched Return of the Jedi, you'll get the reference. But that's where it was, right? It was a fun and exciting time. Well, we're not too far back on I-80, and the phone rings, and I answer it, and it says, "Gold leader, we need to pull over and find a restroom." And I thought, dads, let me talk to you. You're trying to get somewhere. You're trying to make good time. You get in the car and the kids start saying, I need to use the bathroom. Like, it's like, oh, why don't you just do that, right? We were just there. So now we're looking, and I-80 is a little bit barren. It's a little bit barren. There's some times where there's just long stretches of road. And so we come to exit 133. I'm going to make sure I didn't we come to exit, it's 133. Exit 133 is anchored in my mind. It is so anchored. Because we come, and now we come here, and there's a grocery store, there's a gas station, and there's a diner. And the diner is the quick fill gas station Roadhouse, right? I've never seen another quick fill Roadhouse. I don't have the courage to actually eat there. I don't have high confidence in what the food would be like. It may be wonderful. I hope it's wonderful. But that's, so we pull off, and the first thing we go to is we pull in to the grocery store. And I'm waiting for like my niece to get out. And to go into the grocery store. It's not. It's my brother. He gets out and he runs in. And then he comes back out and he's just waving at us. No good here. We got to go somewhere else. And he points. We got to go to the Roadhouse. So we get back in the cars and we go to the next building and we park. And at this point, there was so much. I wish I could act out exactly what I saw. I'm going to do my best to describe it. We get there. We park. He jumps out. He is walking in a different way. There's a hand holding himself in such a way that you know that there is trouble. You just know there is trouble. And he goes in, and he's in there for a while. And so I don't remember who else was in the car, but the cars were pretty much next to each other, and Trace and I are starting to laugh. We think this is funny, and I don't know how long it was. It may have been 3 minutes. It may have been 33 minutes. If I was to guess, it was closer to 33 minutes. I'm sure that's not accurate. He finally comes out, and the urgency and the relief, the urgency was gone, and the relief on his face was there, and he was, right? He got back in the car, and we went the rest of the way. I am going to tell you, because of that experience, I have a memory that is anchored to exit 133 on Interstate 80. I cannot drive by that exit and not die laughing. There are times tears will be streaming down. I'll have to pull over. There's times where I'll have to take a picture and send it to Will and say, hey, you remember this place? Because I remember this place. It was hilarious, right? That was how it was. It's anchored. It is such a connection. It is such a connection, right? And and every once in a while, one of the girls will ask me just to tell that story because it's probably a little bit bigger now than what it was. But I think I'm doing my best to be as honest as possible with that. But there's certain things from that story that you can't unsee, right? That's where we were. But that's something that is anchored. Here we are, like 20 years later. Anytime I go by that exit, I react. I don't miss that exit. You may ignore the Slippery Rock exit on I-79. You go by it all the time. Oh, I went by it, didn't realize I went by it. I cannot go by exit 133 on I-80 and not have a reaction. And every once in a while, I'll send a comment that says, hazmat still here, just whatever. I do what I can, right? That's how siblings are, right? That's right. So hopefully I didn't offend anybody too much with that, and hopefully you caught the drift of what I was saying that. But I tell you that because that story outlines a habit. If I see the Quick Fill Roadhouse, I laugh hard. I laugh hard, right? And so habits are made up, I'm going to give you a three-piece model for this. And this actually comes from a book titled The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. If you really get interested in habits, you can find all sorts of other things out there. But he actually uses a three-part framework. He says that there is a cue, there is a routine, and there is a reward. That is how habits work. There is something that starts it, there's something that you do, and then you feel better after it. So for me, it's seeing Quick Fill Roadhouse. The routine is I remember that story and I laugh and then I feel good. That's like he tells the story of how toothpaste was made in there. Like he has some fascinating stories with that. Pastor John actually shared this. I don't know that he realized that. Who was not in service? Who was not in 8:30 service? Okay, he's going to tell a story about when he gets in the car with his wife in the sermon. But what he said, there's a cue that they get in the car, there's a routine. They do something, and then they feel better, right? But those of you that saw or were here for first service, you know what that is. Those of you that for second service, you'll get that, right? But that's the way it is. There's a cue, there's a routine, there's a reward. That's how it goes. Now, we need to recognize that habits can work for us or against us. Right? How am I doing time-wise? Am I way over? Oh my goodness, I'm way over. Habits can work for us or against us, right? So there's sometimes that you can have a cue, but then the routine is not a good thing. And I share this because I've been wrestling with this. My cue was walking down the stairs. Whenever I would get to the basement, whenever I would set foot on the landing in the basement, the routine was I was telling myself I'm not feeling well. And then the result was I was not doing the things I needed to do. I would find myself scrolling social media, playing a stupid match 3 game. I would like that's where it is. So we need to recognize that's where it is, but this is how we connect these things. What we need to recognize is with this, we can anchor ourselves to the things we want to do. Now, many of us have different cues around our house, right? How many of you have a picture on the wall in your house? Some of you don't. Let's take it. How many of you have houses? All right, make sure I'd lost some of you there for a little bit, right? How many of you have walls in your houses? All right, how many of you have stuff on the walls in your houses, right? You see, I lost that. I didn't want to have anything on the walls in the house. I was like, just paint them white, we'll leave them blank. Trace is like, no, it's got to have color, we got to have stuff. Now we have pictures on the wall. Do you have any beautiful pictures on your wall? Yeah. Do you have any pictures on your wall that maybe it has a piece of scripture? Or something that's some type of encouragement? Yeah. What do they say? I did this with Trace too. I said, we have a beautiful picture in the dining room. It's got a verse on it. We've got a beautiful picture in the kitchen. It's got a verse on it. What do they say? And we didn't know. And I don't know. I hope that doesn't describe you. I mean, if you know what the verse, like I hope that you. But understand, right? You have that. That's something for anchoring. You have something that's intended to be a cue. Right? You walk by the picture, you see the picture, that's the cue. The routine is, remember that. Remember that. Right? And the reward is, be encouraged, be fortified, be calm, be stable, be balanced as you go out to do the things that they would have you do. And I would encourage you today that you can anchor anything. You can anchor anything. I mean, it takes some work. Right now, what I'm working to anchor is the ticking of the clock. Whenever I hear, and I may have shared this with you before, Trace she has a thing about time. I don't get it, but there are certain places in the house where you can sit And you could actually see not one, not two, but 3 clocks in 3 separate rooms at the same time. They're not the same time. You know, they got the arms, but if you sit in the right spot, you could look into the living room, you could look back here, you could see the one in the dining room, and if you looked in the mirror, it would bounce back and you'd see the one in the kitchen, right? You could do that. But you know what those clocks do? They tick. And that's what I'm anchoring myself to now. You see, now whenever I hear the tick of the clock, that's my reminder, Holy Spirit's right with me. My cue, the ticking of the clock. The routine, Holy Spirit's with me. Holy Spirit, this is what I'm dealing with. What do you want me to know? What do you want me to do? Give me some direction, right? Reward, all right? I have purpose. I have direction. I know what I'm supposed to do next. And you can do that with anything. You can anchor a color. You can anchor a song. You can do whatever. But I would encourage you, and I apologize that I didn't have quite the right amount of time here. But you can use this framework to be anchored. You can use this framework to be able to bring some type of stability, some type of peace, even when the storms of life are happening all around you. So that was my intent this morning, was to equip you with something very, very practical. Because if you're not in a storm right now, I hate to be the one to tell this to you. I might as well be a weatherman. There's a storm coming. They're always coming. So how are you going to go through it? How are you going to go through that? And I want to encourage you to be anchored. So with that, I'm going to wrap up here, and I'm just going to put these letters on the board. ACT. Based on what we looked at today, what action will you take? What change will you make? And is there something that you learned today that you can teach to somebody else for your benefit and for theirs?